Hello everyone. Today I am going to give you a view on Henry David Thoreau's prose Where I Lived and What I Lived For. Now let's get started. American essayist, poet and practical philosopher, Henry David Thoreau was a New England transcendentalist. Thoreau began writing nature poetry in the 1840s, with poet Ralph Waldo Emerson as a mentor and friend. In 1845 he began his famous two-year stay on Walden Pond, which he wrote about in his masterwork, Walden. He also became known for his beliefs in transcendentalism and civil disobedience and was a dedicated abolitionist. One of America's most famous writers, Henry David Thoreau is remembered for his philosophical and naturalist writings. He was born and raised in Concord, Massachusetts. In 1845, Thoreau built a small home for himself on Walden Pond, on property owned by Emerson. Sometimes Thoreau worked as a land surveyor or in the pencil factory. Thoreau eventually started writing about his Walden Pond experiment as well. Many were curious about his revolutionary lifestyle, and this interest provided the creative spark for a collection of essays. The publication in 1849, Civil Disobedience, has inspired many leaders of protest movements around the world. In his later years, Thoreau battled an illness that had plagued him for decades. He had tuberculosis, which he had contracted decades earlier. To restore his health, Thoreau went to Minnesota in 1861, but the trip didn't improve his condition. He finally succumbed to the disease on May 6, 1862. About the prose, Where I Lived and What I Lived For is taken from his Chapter 2 essay from Walden. In this essay Thoreau express and recalls their several places settled before selecting Walden Pond and describes about enjoying in solitude and benefits of reading. About Walden. Walden published on 1854 that text is the reflection upon simple living in natural surroundings. The essay Walden details Thoreau experiences over course of 2 years 2 months and 2 days in cabin he built near Walden Pond, Concord, Massachusetts woodland owned by his friend and mentor R. W. Emerson. Synopsis. Introduction. Thoreau recalls, full of leisure, Independence Day, woodhouse construction, God living in eternity, reading benefits, education equality, conclusion. Now let's move on to the prose, Where I Lived and What I Lived For. First is Thoreau recalls. Thoreau recalls the several places where he nearly settled before selecting Walden Pond. He quotes the Roman philosopher Cato's warning that it is best to consider buying a farm very carefully before signing the papers. He had been interested in the nearby Hollowell farm, but the owner's wife unexpectedly decided she wanted to keep the farm. Full of leisure. Forced to simplify his life, he concludes that it is best to live free and uncommitted. Thoreau takes to the woods, dreaming of an existence free of obligations and full of leisure. He proudly announces that he resides far from the post office and all the constraining social relationships the mail system represents. Independence Day. When Thoreau first moves into his dwelling on Independence Day, it gives him a proud sense of being a god on Olympus. Woodhouse construction. Even though the house still lacks a chimney and plastering, he declares that his poorly insulated walls give him the benefit of fresh air on summer nights. He prefers to reside here, sitting on his own humble wooden chair. He is free from time, announcing grandiosely that time is a river in which he goes fishing. God living in eternity. He participates in the flow of time, like a God living in eternity. He concludes by urging all of us to sludge through our existence until we gauge truth on what he terms our realometer, our means of measuring the reality of things. Reading benefits. One of the many delightful pursuits in which Thoreau is able to indulge is reading. Whether or not Thoreau is ironic in such monumental reflections about books is open to. It is certain that reading is one of his chief pastimes in the solitude of the woods. During the busy days of homebuilding, he says he kept Homer's Iliad on his table throughout the summer, but only glanced at it now and then. Thoreau praises the ability to read the ancient classics in the original Greek and Latin, disdaining the translations offered by the modern cheap press. Thoreau compares the great reader to an athlete who has subjected himself to long training and regular exercise. The grandeur of oratory does not impress him as much as the achievements of a written book. He says it is no wonder that Alexander the Great carried a copy of the Iliad around with him on his military campaigns. Thoreau also urges us to read widely, gently mocking those who limit their reading to the Bible, and to read great things, not the popular entertainment books found in the library. Despite the progress of modern society in technology and transportation, he says real progress, that of the mind and soul, is being forgotten. He reproaches his townsmen for believing that the ancient Hebrews were the only people in the world to have had a holy scripture, ignoring the sacred writings of others, like the Hindus. Education equality. Thoreau calls out for more public spending on education. Thoreau implicitly blames the local class system for encouraging fine breeding in noblemen, but neglecting the task of ennobling the broader population. He thus calls out for an aristocratic democracy. Instead of noblemen, let us have noble villages of men. Conclusion. He concludes on a sermonizing note, urging all of us to sludge through our existence until we hit rock bottom and can gauge truth on what he terms our realometer, our means of measuring the reality of things. Theme of the prose. The main idea of Walden, by Henry David Thoreau, is to find the meaning of life. He set out to contemplate life in himself and to find out man's role in the world. Please subscribe for more videos.